Reciprocal recurrent selection can be used to inform selection of candidate potato lines that are either advanced to a gene editing or genetic modification system, or crossed and selected to induce clonal gamete formation by arresting meiotic recombination and chromosome reduction. Crosses of parent plants bearing clonal gametes are planned and executed based upon predicted heterotic performance at the polyploid level. The final product is a homogeneous population of hybrid polyploid potato seed, or derivative thereof, bearing both parents' complete nuclear genomes. In some instances, the method is used to generate seedless plants. So that sounds like a lot of very precise and technical language. But the part that matters to us and the description of the corn abstract is very similar at the broad brush level. What they are doing, and the term they're using is boosted breeding, is what they're calling this. They are creating, effectively, new potato plants that have the entire genetic complement of both of their parents. So instead of the male potato creating haploid gametes and contributing a haploid gamete, half of the male potato's genetic complement to the offspring, and the mother potato producing haploid gametes and contributing half of her genetic complement to the offspring, they've got 100% of dads and 100% of moms' genetic complements producing these tetraploid, effectively potatoes, that are 100% related to both parents. And why? Their argument is it's better. You're going to make more potato per plant by doing this.
And they, in the All In podcast, in which this is revealed by David Friedberg, they display plants. Potato, I think, is the one that they use, where they show that basically you get a much larger yield across the entire plant. More potatoes. They're not larger potatoes. He's very careful about this. Yep. But you get a bigger, more vigorous plant, and you get a lot more product out of it. And it raises the possibility that they are going to simply start doubling yields on crops by using this technique. That's the implication.
And we're about to start showing a few of the clips from the podcast, which is the only, as far as we know, formal presentation of what the work is so far. Just a 20-minute, and we'll of course link to that, the whole 20 minutes in the show notes. But one of the other hosts, I guess, I hadn't caught on that the CEO is actually also one of the hosts, but one of the other hosts asks, okay, but what are the costs, right? And one of the questions that Friedberg, the CEO of Ohalo, kind of does a feint around, doesn't address is, you can't make more out of nothing. Where's it coming from? Won't it require more fertilizer, for instance? And he says, honestly, I believe, well, yeah, if you're getting more yield, you're going to need more fertilizer. So that's one big issue that is not otherwise discussed in any discussions I've seen about this, which is that there's no free lunch. I mean, quite literally in this case, we're talking about there is no free lunch. We're going to spend some time talking about what the genetic implications are, the evolutionary implications. But even if there were none, even if they had waved their magic molecular biology wand and created plants that are now producing twice or more the yield of the plants from yesterday, and there were no other effects, you are going to have to feed many more nutrients into the system in order to get that greater yield.
Well, hold on. I want to be careful about the idea that there's no free lunch, because there are places that you could get a free lunch, even though my theoretical background is evolutionary trade-offs. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. And in one sense, there is simply no free lunch to be had with almost any creature that you would encounter in the world, because they have been optimized. So Thomas Sowell once said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I managed to say the very same thing in about 1,000 times as many words in my dissertation. But anyway.
Well, that man has an eloquence to him.
He does.
Really remarkable.
You have to borrow.
You do too, but not in this case.
Not that good. Yeah. You have to borrow from somewhere, but there are places where you could borrow from that would be effectively free. And let me just give you...
Still not actually free, though.
It's not free in a technical sense, but it's free in an agricultural sense. So let's just say, for example, that let's say that potato plants have a contingency plan for a drought that lasts 50 years. They don't, but let's say that they did. They have a mechanism for shriveling something down in the soil that can be dormant for 50 years, and then when the right conditions emerge, it brings forth a progenitor plant. It's basically been in suspended animation. You could, as an agriculturalist, borrow from that capacity. If you know
that you're always going to have water to add.
Right.
Right.
And you're not going to be there 50 years down the road. If there's been some catastrophe, you will have tilled up the soil many times. So the point is, you can borrow from some place.
But you're borrowing from the capacity of the plant,
right?
From its resilience, from its ability to respond to environmental stressors. And so you are assuming that the utter control that you, the agriculturalist human, has over the system currently, you will always continue to have, which means that the farmers to whom you are selling your products become entirely dependent on you, because their products that you have sold to them are now fragile.
Well, but from an agricultural perspective, my point is just, if these people have come up with a mechanism,
Ohalo Genetics.
If Ohalo Genetics has come up with a mechanism for doubling yields, and they've borrowed from some characteristic that's irrelevant, then good on them, right? I don't think that's what's happened here.
Right.
But I do not want to just say, because technically you're borrowing from some capacity that the plant has that would be useful in some context, that you're cheating, because the point is agriculture cheats, right? Even agriculture where you just simply till the soil to do away with competitors, you're borrowing from some place that you can afford to borrow.
Okay, so I hear that point. I maintained my objection to it, that you're still borrowing from somewhere. But actually, my point here with regard to no free lunch was a little bit different, which is the soils are still the soils. And given what we have done to almost all of our soils over the last 100 years, they are largely not rich enough to produce the yields that even the same soils were producing 50 years ago and 100 years ago. So producing, and I'm not saying that what we need isn't, I'm not saying that what we need is, but I'm not saying that what we need isn't greater agricultural yield per unit landmass. But that will come with the need to put more nutrients in the form of agrochemicals onto that same land. You can't produce more potato without also adding the plant is one thing. The plant will produce potato, but the plant will need the building blocks, which include nitrogen and phosphorus and all of the rest of the things that are in the soil, or are added from from the agrochemicals.
Yes, and we see this already. Before you get to Ohalo's innovation here, we see this in the supercrops that are currently grown. These supercrops are not really supercrops. They're totally inferior to their wild counterparts, and they require conditions to be created for them that don't make any sense.
Totally inferior in terms of their robustness. Totally inferior in terms of their ability to withstand environmental stressors, and totally inferior in terms of their nutritional value and their flavor.
Well, they're effectively everything is compromised in favor of market parameters. So you have a crop that's literally cannot grow in the wild, cannot compete against its wild counterpart. Right. But if you use giant machines to destroy all of the alternative plants that might be growing there, and you effectively treat the topsoil as a physical medium, and you put in all of these agrochemical inputs, then you get this much larger plant because... Anyway, the point is you borrowed from all of the natural capacities that the plant has to protect itself, to compete against competitors, and then you've put in the inputs of which the product is effectively being made.
An analogy that just occurred to me, and maybe this won't work, but imagine you're a knight wearing really heavy armor, and you can't go very fast because the armor is heavy and it restricts your movement. And a magic fairy comes in and says, you know what, I'm going to put a bubble around you that you can't feel. It doesn't restrict your movement at all. And you're going to be able to move as if you were wearing almost nothing at all. And you'll be fine because I got my magic. And the knight, of course, begins to be able to move through the world much more effectively and destroys the other knights Until the magic fairy dust disappears.
Yeah.
At which point he immediately crumples over and dies.
Dependent on the magic fairy dust.
Yeah.
So modern agriculture has become this nightmare, and this is seemingly likely to be a new chapter in the same. The staff here is not highly biological, and I believe that
I think they're made of carbon chains.
No doubt they function in a biological way. They probably even eat potatoes, but
they do.
But I believe that part of what's going on is a complicated systems mentality being imposed on a complex system. Mm-hmm. I believe there's also a story here which is just unbearably about the market failure and its effect on the way we are now thinking scientifically, right? So in some sense, if we think about, and this is not an area of expertise for either you or me, but there's a question about what their technology actually does. And then there's a question about what is plausible enough for this to catch economic fire, right? In other words, for a lot of people, most of whom, maybe they took biology in high school, a few of them will have taken some biology in college, they know what a chromosome is. They have a rough idea about genes and proteins or something. But this is not, they don't think deeply about this. And they certainly don't think deeply about what evolution has done to the natural ancestors of the crops that we are now growing in very unnatural ways, and whether or not it's plausible that by doing some fancy laboratory stuff that you can double the yield. It's one thing to make a plant that produces a whole lot more tuber at the expense of some other part that maybe you don't want, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe farmers don't want flowering from their potatoes because they want those resources to go not into fruits but into the tubers, right? So you could borrow from there. But what does it mean to just say, oh, this plant's doing everything better because it's got more genes to choose from? Then why didn't nature do that? That's an important question. Okay. So you've got people who are thinking complicated systems and applying it to a complex system. And then you've got the market, which is ironically a complex system, in which what sounds good to investors, what sounds good to consumers may have a lot more influence on how profitable this is than how accurate or useful the technology itself is. And we have seen this a zillion times where, and then this starts driving the science. So I remember back when I was studying senescence and cancer, that there was a very flashy result involving C. elegans, the nematode that we use as a model system. It's a simple animal. Mm-hmm. And a simple genetic modification resulted in a doubling of lifespan.
That's right. I remember this, yeah.
And I immediately knew, not specifically what was going on, but I knew how the story was going to play out. And it's like, okay, where'd you borrow from? What can't that animal do? But of course, it made a lot of sense from the people who were hovering at the border between science and industry. Mm-hmm. It made a lot of sense for them to pretend that what they just discovered was that there was a gene that you could turn off that doubled lifespan, and heck, maybe we can double our own lifespan.
Why didn't the worm think of that?
Right, exactly.
Selection must be foolish.
Right, well, you have to know that selection actually opposes senescence, which then tells you, well, if it didn't do this, then there must be a cost that isn't worth paying to get that major benefit. What is it? It turned out that the animals in question were, I believe it was no longer famine tolerant, right? So you could increase their lifespan if you turned off their famine tolerance. And the point is, there might be circumstances in which you want to do that, but you didn't suddenly discover a way to double lifespan. You figured out how to borrow from one place to do something else. That's right. And the problem is that the market is not necessarily interested at this level. Mm-hmm. The market wants to know if there's going to be a massive profit to be made, and it is not interested in externalities specifically.
One of the other things this unlocks is creating actual seed that you can put in the ground in crops that you can't do that in today. So potatoes, the third largest source of calories. But the way we grow potatoes, you guys remember the movie The Martian, you chop up potatoes and you put them back in the ground. Because the seed that comes out of a potato, which grows on the top in the flower, every one of those seed is genetically different because of what I just showed on this chart, right? You get half the DNA from the mother, half the DNA from the father. So every seed has different genetics. So there's no potato seed industry today. And potato is like $100 billion market. With our system, not only can we make potatoes higher yielding and make them disease resistant, what we also make is perfect seed. So farmers can now plant seed in the ground, which saves them about 20% of revenue, takes out all the disease risk, and makes things much more affordable and easier to manage for farmers. So it creates entirely new seed industries. So we're going to be applying this boosted technology that we've discovered across nearly every major crop worldwide. It'll both increase yield, but it will also have a massive impact on the ability to actually deliver seed and help farmers and make food prices lower.
The idea of perfect seed is alarming for exactly the reasons that we've been talking about, right? The world is not a static place. The idea that it would be useful to have seeds for potatoes, I see that, right? I see that the way that that we have, amazingly, that basically very much like the original Incas were planting potatoes is, on a much smaller scale related to how we're doing it today. But the idea that perfect seed is the goal, by which he means completely uniform, completely genetically uniform, erasing all variability. He thinks, Friedberg in this clip, he says, take out all disease risk. Well, again, in a world where nothing else is evolving, sure. But the diseases, the pathogens will find the potatoes that you have produced that may currently have no pathogens that are particularly suited to them. Those pathogens will evolve into being very effective at going at these potatoes with their so-called perfect seeds, which are totally uniform, and you will have crops completely wiped out. So, there is a lot of discussion in agriculture about the risks of monocropping as opposed to more traditional forms of intercropping and growing with different growth forms. And of course, you can't do you can't do Swidden agriculture at scale for a lot of reasons we've talked about before. And you can't even do a lot of the intercropping at scale very much. And we have a lot of people to feed on this planet. So we're not being Pollyannas here. We're not pretending that we're going to be able to feed absolutely everyone from backyard farms or traditional fincas, right? However, you can't take out all disease risk by producing a single uniform thing that is what everyone is going to be planting. Have you learned nothing from the errors of 20th century monocropping agriculture, where you get entire crops wiped out because one thing goes like, oh, those are all the same. I'm going to invite me and all of my friends over to eat all of it all at once.
So the overarching story here is going to be that what they are doing is a natural extension of the mistakes that we have been making throughout highly technological agriculture.
Precisely. Yes.
And there's hidden stuff here, right? So the idea of perfect seed, I'm not sure if it's inherently any worse than what we're doing, because what I would imagine is that the potatoes that people plant in so-called traditional agriculture, which is really anything but traditional, but the potatoes they're planting are presumably done from cuttings or potatoes. Actually, they're just going to take potatoes from a plant. So that's not giving you any more diversity either. You're basically just taking a potato plant and spreading it over a huge...
But the potato plants as they currently exist have two parents and only two parents. And each potato plant is a different mix,
right? But
of those parental gametes.
But my guess is that the potatoes you order, if you're a large-scale potato farmer, those potatoes are part of some giant clone that requires those same inputs. Because
not a clone. So I think no. I think Ohalo Genetics would like us to be producing potato clones, and this argument is precisely at the heart of why people are increasingly valuing heirloom varietals,
right,
and are seed saving. Like, the reason to seed save is so that you don't end up with perfect seed.
Right. But what I'm saying is that it will look like an advantage because what you're comparing it to is feeble already. Right? At the level of how much diversity is there in your potato field, there's none, because you got a bunch of things that were identical by virtue of the fact that they're effectively cuttings from the same ancestor. So it won't look like an increase in pesticide requirements at the level of growing these things from seed, except for a couple of places. to the extent that people are planting potatoes in order to get potato plants, right? So the potato, it turns out, is a perennial. It can die back. The above ground stuff can die back. It dies back to these tubers, and you get new potato shoots in the spring. What that means is that those plants can spring up very rapidly. If you think about it, at the beginning of the spring, there's not enough light to produce a high profit, but you're not starting from a cotyledon, the tiny little leaves that come out of the seed. You're starting from this big store of energy that you put down last year that turns into a plant that leaps up at very rapid rate. What that means is it is capable of shading out its annual competitors very easily because it is not depending on photosynthesis to do all of that growth. So what this says, what's hidden here, is that you actually require herbicide in order to plant from seed.
And herbicide and fertilizer.
Herbicide and fertilizer both, right?
Because the potato came with its own. It created the shade, which acted as the competitor, as the competition, and it came with the fertilizer in the form of the potato.
Yeah, and it also came with a pesticide, which is the reason that you don't eat the eyes of potatoes, right? So the point is all of this stuff is built into this elegant potato. And what's more, if you think about, if you compare their fancy seed potato, right, grown from seed, this boosted seed, if you compare it to whatever, I don't know that Monsanto sells potatoes, but let's say that they do, right? Whatever the major supplier of potato starts is, that is the result of the huge potato growing industry. If you compare it to that, you're going to see a lot of the harm is hidden. But if you compare it to what happens when you plant potatoes in a traditional way, imagine the following thing, okay? You've got potatoes. They're variable because they start with sexual reproduction where two parents that are a bit different come together, they fuse their genomes, right? You distribute those seeds over some piece of territory, right? Now what happens? Well, now you get selection in amongst these things because that particular, let's say it's a terraced plot in the Andes.
Yep.
Okay. Now you've got some idiosyncratic plot of land and you've started thousands of plants on it. And some of them are absolutely terrible for that plot of land and they just don't make it. And some of them are surprisingly good. Okay. Now the next year you've got potatoes that were selected for your particular place on earth and they are now interbreeding. So you get this pattern of selection where you are now growing potatoes that are basically bespoke for that piece of dirt.
This is it right here. The ones that didn't survive there, they're bad potatoes. No, they're not bad potatoes.
They're good for someone else.
Because selection is not universal this way. And this is the era of eugenics. This is the era of social Darwinism. And this is the era of the arrogance of the biotech industry, right? Oh, we're just looking for the best. There is no best. Best is context dependent. Those potatoes on that particular, east-facing slope in the Andes with this much iron and that much rainfall and, will not be the best potatoes, maybe 5 miles to the south, or 2 miles, or 20 feet up slope even.
But
because individual climatic and weather and soil conditions and competitor conditions are going to provide exactly the situation under which the plant itself evolves to do best or not. And you don't end up with universal best because there is no universal best because it's all context dependent.
Right. Now, the market sees it very differently.
Of course it does.
The market is very interested in turning you into an addict, right? So addiction, subscription.
Yes.
The point is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to sell you a seed for a plant that will give you spectacular yields if you give it these inputs, irrespective of what you're growing it on or where you're growing it. Right?
Doesn't matter.
Right. So the point is,
we don't care where you are. We got the product for you.
We've got the product for you. Yeah. Whereas what's really happening here, I suspect, is that this, to the extent that Ohalo has something that actually does create something measurably better. Let's say that they've got a mechanism for growing the stuff in which you actually get higher yields. Well, what they're actually doing is they are correcting for a defect in the exact mindset that they are using to create these things, right? In other words, it is this highly technologically intensive agriculture that rendered the potatoes we currently grow feeble.
Yeah.
And so what they are doing is they are, with new costs that we will discover soon, they are creating a temporarily freed from feebleness potato. That's not saying that they've done, and the whole phraseology here, they basically say, amazing as it sounds, that what they're doing is they're unlocking nature's potential. They're accelerating evolution. No. You are taking a crop that has been destroyed by meddling, in which the very thing that was removed from it was its capacity to adapt. Right? We've substituted technology for this adaptive, self-adapting nature of these crops, which, yes, will sometimes give you a very inferior potato, but will sometimes give you a superior potato for the exact place you intend to grow potatoes. What it doesn't do is have you on the internet searching catalogs to figure out what to order. Right? And so the point is, that's galling from the point of view of industry. It's a missed opportunity to sell you something. The idea that you're going to be self-sufficient. Well, what am I? I'm a farmer. What do? I grow potatoes. These are the ones. I grow them right here, and I know exactly how to do it. I know them intimately. Right? That is not a happy scenario from the point of view of a potential industry that would like to turn you into an addict for its seed catalog, for its fertilizers, and this and that.
That's right.
So anyway, I think that's the overarching story here.